Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction. Today we're taking a look at the second part of the French Revolution Oversimplified series, and let's get going immediately.
King Louis and his family were now in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where for the next couple of years, he watched as the revolutionary government began to strip away his power. And fearing for his safety, he had to stay on their good side. Hey!
Yes, almost immediately after the National Assembly was created, they started to immediately pass reforms, some of which curtailed the king's power. For example, the 1789 August decrees abolished feudalism, it abolished feudal dues and church tithes, it established equality before the law, it made public offices available to everyone, freedom of worship was established, and special privileges for towns and provinces were cancelled. And yes, Louis had to remain on the good side of the revolutionaries to cling on to at least some power, and so he was forced to swallow many bitter reforms that he did not want.
Hey, look who it is. It's my favorite revolutionaries. Yep, I'm your #1 fan. What can I do for you? Hey, King Louis. So we've made a few decisions. First, all of your friends in the nobility are gonna have to pay taxes the same as everyone else. Great idea. I love it. And as a side note, the tax money can no longer pay for all your lavish parties. Great. I hate those parties. They're so awkward. And also, we're taking away your Porsche. Oh, come on!
Now, come on.
I mean, yay. The king continually found demand after demand being made of him to prove his support for the revolution. On one occasion, a mob would invade the palace and demand he wear the revolutionary bonnet. This is the face of a man who is definitely
This is actually real, and looks quite ridiculous on him, doesn't it?
pretending he wants to wear that bonnet. Now around here, I want to mention that one thing King Louis had a problem with was people constantly raiding his palace. But one thing he didn't have a problem with was raiding noobs. Now where was I? Oh yeah. Seeing the situation rapidly turning against him, the king decided it might be a good idea to leave France and mount a campaign to retake his country from abroad. Luckily for him, he was married to an Austrian, so on the night of June 20th, 1791, the king and his family disguised themselves as servants and attempted to flee to the Austrian Netherlands. The royal carriage made a stop in the town of Varennes, and the postmaster there was like, "Hey guys, what's up?"
Yes, the Flight of Varennes is perhaps one of the most famous incidents during the French Revolution, and yeah, this was a pretty coordinated escape attempt, and they were so close to the border, but they just had to stop at this town, and then they got caught, and yeah, it's all downhill for Louis and his family from here on out.
Where are you off to? We are but a collection of inconspicuous servants heading for the border for no particular reason at all. Say, you, the fat one, you look kind of familiar. Aren't you the king? Nope. Let me see your passport. It says here you're King Louis the 16th. Nope, not me. Take him away, boys. The king was promptly returned to Paris, but now the jig was up. His lack of support for the revolution was clear to all, and many considered him a straight-up traitor who tried to...
It should be made clear. I don't think people understand this. Louis was not hated at the beginning of the revolution in that way he would become later on. He was actually, declared almost a champion of the revolution because he outwardly accepted all of these reforms and the people cheered him for it. But this exposed his true feelings about the revolution, and people were furious.
Abandon his people. As a result, the new constitution of 1791 completely reduced his powers to that of a simple figurehead, a constitutional monarch. However, radicals, such as those in the Jacobin Club, were outraged that the king wasn't to be removed entirely. So a month later, these radicals staged a protest on the Champ de Mars, calling for the king's removal. The government of Paris feared an insurrection was mounting, and they sent the military to disperse the crowd. The confrontation escalated and resulted in the Revolutionary National Guard firing on a crowd of revolutionaries. It was a massacre. The incident exposed a deep division within the Brotherhood of the Revolution. On one side, the moderates who wanted to keep the king as a figurehead. On the other, radicals who wanted to see the king deposed.
Yes, factionalism was a really big thing during the revolution, and that's the thing. Everyone agrees that they want reform, they want this revolution to succeed, but how to go about it, they were not agreeing on at all. And as a result, all of these factions started to clash, and this would continue to spiral out of control as we go on.
And heads roll. In the wake of the massacre, these radicals received a wave of support. And speaking of rolling heads, one form of equality the revolution introduced was equality in execution. This meant no more torturous drawing and quartering, no more inhumane hanging. They wanted all criminals, regardless of economic status, to receive the same penalty, a quick and painless one. Luckily, a man by the name of Dr. Joseph Guillotine had an idea. A heavy blade that falls like thunder. The head flies off, blood spurts, and the man is no more. The guillotine, otherwise known as the national razor. The guillotine made its debut in 1791 as the new form of execution. The writings of Marat and others continue.
Yes, the guillotine was an interesting device that, like they said, was created to get equality in executions. And that's how far they wanted this equality ideal to go. But yeah, the guillotine was a successful method of executing people, compared at least to the medieval contraptions and forms of punishment, or capital punishment rather. And the guillotine remained France's standard method of judicial execution until 1981, when capital punishment in France was abolished. Actually, the last person executed by guillotine was in 1977. So it was not that long ago that the guillotine was still in use.
Continued to call for the execution of anyone suspected of working against the revolution. For him, this included some members of the clergy and nobility who had previously benefited from the cruel system of inequality that existed before the revolution. In many parts of the countryside, local lords had found themselves become a target. Sire, the peasants, they're revolting. Oh, come on, that's a bit harsh. Sure, they smell a bit, but I wouldn't say they're revolting. Oh yes, I see what you mean. Increasingly, these French aristocrats began fleeing France to find solitude in other parts of Europe. And once again, fear began to take hold. The privileged classes of these foreign nations didn't like what they were seeing because they feared revolutionary ideas may spread to their own land.
And with hindsight in mind, they were right to be worried. These revolutionary ideas would not be exported immediately, but given some time, these ideas of the revolution would cause a lot of trouble. It would culminate in the spring times of the people, the revolutions of 1848, when basically all of Europe had this revolutionary fervor and trying to follow in the footsteps of the French Revolution. And like I said, they were right to be worried here.
The National Assembly, actually now the Legislative Assembly, feared that these nations may decide to attack. Then why don't we attack them first? No, you idiots, we are definitely not ready for war yet. Did somebody say something? France declared war on Austria in April 1792 and immediately got...
Yes. Now, it should be said that Austria and Prussia were looking to avoid war at this point. They issued something called the Declaration of Pillnitz, and it threatened vague but severe consequences if anything bad should happen to Louis XVI and his family. However, from the perspectives of Emperor Leopold of Austria and Frederick William II of Prussia, this declaration was a non-committal gesture to the French monarchist and émigré nobles to reassure them that, they were still in favor of monarchy and all that. But the revolutionary leaders and people did not take it that way. They saw this as a very threatening statement, and this really riled them up.
Pummeled. It also didn't help that Austria's ally, Prussia, joined in the fighting. The Prussian Duke of Brunswick posted a letter warning the revolutionaries that if anything happened to the king, he would burn Paris to the ground.
Yes, this is the famous Brunswick Manifesto, which was actually not written by the Duke of Brunswick, as written by Louis XVI's cousin, the Prince de Condé. And it basically declared that the king was to be restored to all his full powers, and anyone opposing them would be condemned to death under martial law. And this had quite the opposite effect than intended. It didn't scare anyone away. In fact, it strengthened the resolve of the revolutionary government and army. And it should be said that at this point, the army is in total chaos, the French army that is, because most officers had been aristocrats, and basically all of them had fled. And if they had not fled, they had joined the revolutions, but that was a very small number, relatively speaking. And there was no effective way of mobilizing troops and equipping them, so France was, at the outset, not in a good position to win this war.
The Duke's letter proved to be a massive success in inspiring the people of Paris to do the exact opposite of what he intended. They were enraged by the threat, and on the 10th of August 1792, the tension in the city exploded, and a mob stormed the king's palace. Fighting broke out between the revolutionaries and the king's Swiss guard, with casualties in the hundreds. King Louis fled and took refuge in the chamber of the Legislative Assembly, where Robespierre and his radical Jacobins were gaining ever more power. Given the developing situation, the chamber decided to hold a vote, and in what some considered to be a second revolution, it was decided to suspend the monarchy entirely. King Louis XVI was now just plain old Louis, and he was sent to a prison cell where an eye could be kept on him. A month later, the newly established National Convention officially declared the French Republic, and
you can see how the legislative assemblies are changing names all the time. That's because they keep changing the constitution, and it will continue to change several times over before this whole revolution business is put to an end by Napoleon. But yes, here we have the first French Republic declared in 1792, and it was a defining moment of world history.
Society underwent a massive change. Enlightened ideas of democracy and equality were being implemented, but very quickly, these ideas seemed to become secondary to fear, paranoia, and a thirst for blood. The new republic began working to violently remove any semblance of the old royalist regime. The church became a prime target. Priests who refused to take an oath to the revolution were deported or arrested. A new state-sponsored atheistic religion named the Cult of Reason was created.
Yes, the revolution saw a wave of de-Christianization. The Roman Catholic Church was seen as working against revolution ideals and aligning themselves with the monarchy, which is true, to be fair. However, in its place, this state-sponsored atheistic religion, I know that's sort of an oxymoron, an atheistic religion. Well, this religion was called the Cult of Reason, and it's really hard to find any traits, ideas, or activities that really define this atheistic religion, other than there were some core principles like adherence to reason, liberty, nature, and revolution. So it was an enlightenment religion, quasi-religion. It's a really weird replacement for the Catholic Church, I must say.
As a replacement for the Catholic Church, Notre Dame, along with many other churches, had their religious treasures destroyed and were converted to temples of...
Yes, unfortunately, as a historian, I must express my sadness over the fact that many French religious and historical artifacts were destroyed during this time. For example, the original French coronation crown, which had existed for centuries at this point, was totally destroyed. And that's a shame, because it would be really nice to have a look at these artifacts today, but that's just how it goes.
Reason. Even the Christian calendar didn't survive, as a brand new revolutionary calendar was soon introduced.
Yes, the de-Christianization went so far as to abolish the Gregorian calendar, and a wholly rational system was introduced based on the number 10. As you can see, 100 seconds, 100 minutes, 10 hours, 10 months. So, yeah, this calendar is entirely confusing, and luckily there are some people out there that have been able to convert these dates into something that makes sense to us. But yeah, this really shows you how radical the revolution is becoming at this point.
Hey, honey, I'm home. Yeah, whatever, jerk. Whoa, what's wrong with you? You forgot. Forgot what? Everything. This entire year. My birthday was on the 3rd of Germinal, our anniversary was the 12th of Thermidor, and you promised that in Freimaer, we'd go on a romantic weekend trip to Venice. No, I said we'd do that in December. December hasn't been a thing for years. The government of Paris, now under the control of the radical sans-culottes, began rounding up suspected enemies of the revolution and sending them to prison in the thousands. Naturally, a large number of those arrested were members of the clergy and aristocracy. As France's foreign enemies continued to close in, panic spread. Georges Danton made impassioned calls for men to defend the Republic, and tens of thousands of troops left Paris for the front lines. However, in their absence, Paris was left to its own devices. As enemy troops arrived in Verdun, the people of Paris feared that their crowded prisons were becoming a breeding ground for counter-revolutionary conspiracy. What would happen if the Prussians reached Paris and freed the aristocrats? Marat believed he knew what would happen. The aristocrats would enact their vengeance on the people. Fearing those they had already imprisoned, mobs descended on Paris's prisons. They broke in, and during the brutal September massacres, aristocrats, priests, and others were tried and executed on the spot. Even women and children weren't spared, with over 1,600 victims.
Yes, and some sort of mass psychosis really overtook the revolutionaries at this point, and the brutality and inhumanity behind these actions are truly astonishing. And it's a stark reminder that while humans have come far from the days of old, so to speak, it really doesn't take much for humans to become very savage and brutal towards each other. And, that is a fact of life, I guess, but still, it's quite shocking to see it taken to these levels.
Word of the massacre spread across Europe. One British newspaper wondered, are these the rights of man? Is this the liberty of human nature? But there was still one man in particular that Robespierre and his radicals really wanted to see executed. Austria and Prussia pledged that after they defeated France, they'd return King Louis to the throne. Well, checkmate Austria and Prussia, because you can't return a man to the throne if he's already dead. Citizen Louis Capet was put on trial for treason. Obviously, he was found guilty, but his punishment was less certain. Many moderates wanted to simply deport him, but Robespierre insisted the revolution could only live if the king was dead. A vote was held, and by just one vote, Louis was sentenced to the guillotine.
Yes, but it should be said that all other options, there were quite a few other options. A few voted for death, but with conditions. Others voted for life imprisonment and then banishment, which was the second most popular option. But yeah, the death without conditions won overall.
If you don't mind, I'd like to say a few words first. Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. Wait, you're too loud. They can't hear me. Hang on, I haven't finished yet. Wait, dude.
Yes, several versions of what exactly happened at the execution exists. The account of Charles Henry Sanson, the executioner, is one of the more popular ones, and it details this supposed impromptu, I wouldn't call it speech because it was pretty short, but yeah, he got to say a few words before he was executed, more than what was portrayed here. But yeah, it was a moment that would really change the history of Europe forever.
Uncool. In her prison cell,
Pretty uncool.
Marie Antoinette heard the guns fire, signaling her husband's death. Before long, she would meet the same fate.
Yep.
Back on the war front, France defied all expectations and actually managed to push the enemy back. But then more countries joined the coalition against France, and it all went to pot again.
Yeah, no joke. After the execution of Louis XVI, everyone in Europe was horrified by how this could have happened to a holy, anointed monarch of France. one of the greatest monarchies in the world. And this made all the conservatives in the rest of Europe fear this development, and as such, basically all of Europe declared war on France.
What do we do? Conscript the masses. The National Convention introduced a conscription law, with each regional department having to meet a certain quota of.
Yes, this is where the famous levée en masse was instituted, the mass levy or mass conscription. And it was unlike any other form of conscription seen in French history or even European history, in that previous conscriptions have been used to form garrison militias or been used to supplement the professional corps of the national army. However, the concept of mass conscription was built on the idea of the citizen. The idea of the citizen came with the French Revolution. That meant the new political rights to the mass of French people, meant also created obligations to the state. The nation was seen now as a community of all the peoples, and its defense became the responsibility of all its citizens. So this levée en masse conscription laws that were passed basically meant that all able-bodied men between the ages of 18 to 25 were conscripted into the French army, and it was a massively successful system that enabled France to take on all of these adversaries at once, and this system would be widely adopted by the rest of Europe after this.
Men for the army. However, not everyone was happy with this new law. You see, while Paris was definitely a hotbed for radical revolutionary fervor, some of the regions outside of Paris weren't quite so keen on the revolution. Some were largely still conservative, still supported the church.
Yes, it is important to remember this fact that the revolution was most popular in the cities. That's where the most radical people could be found. But in the countryside, people just wanted to get on with their lives. And, things weren't that bad for everyone. And so in the more rural parts of France, you would often find more conservative and royalist communities. And of course, many of these communities also supported the Catholic Church, which had been an integral part of France for a millennia at this point. And many people didn't want to abandon that for some cult of reason. So yeah, I think we sometimes forget that the revolution was certainly had widespread support, but not nearly as much as it's sometimes portrayed as.
And just didn't suffer from that much inequality before the revolution. So as the revolution turned increasingly violent and anti-Christian, many were outraged. Now they were being conscripted to fight for the new republic they hated. That was the last straw. Counter-revolutionary uprisings erupted in a number of regions across France. Some would last for years, such as in the northwest, where a large-scale uprising was led by the Owls. Why were they called the Owls? Because their leader was named Jean Owl. Why was he called Jean Owl? Possibly because he could do a really good impression of an owl. Really? That's what we're going with?
Apparently.
Owls? Just because this guy can do an impression of one? Hit him with it, Jean. Hoot, hoot. Yeah, okay, that's pretty good. The Chouannerie uprising lasted all the way until 1800. In the summer of 1793, the southern city of Toulon invited the British Navy over for some tea and crumpets. And then they asked if they'd possibly like to stay and occupy the city. Being an important naval base, this was a heavy blow to the Republic.
An important naval base doesn't even begin to cover it. Toulon was the most important naval base in the south of France. And a certain Napoleon Bonaparte would be there to resolve the situation. And if you'd like more on that, watch my Siege of Toulon video.
Who sent a relatively unknown young captain by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte to help stage the siege of the city. Toulon was recaptured by France in the winter, and for his service, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. The most infamous counter-revolution, however, occurred in the Vendée region.
Yes, the Vendée insurgency was one of the most bloody chapters of the revolution, and it was marked by hideous atrocities on both sides. And this insurgency in this area probably resulted in at least 100,000 casualties.
Throughout 1793, revolutionary forces clashed with the region's Catholic and Royal Army. The Republic defeated the counter-revolution through cruel pacification. In particular, General Jean...
Yeah, cruel pacification, that's one word for it. And, you know, this conflict was so brutal that when Napoleon was ordered to go to the Vendée and participate in the fighting there, he actually refused.
Jean-Baptiste Carrier committed brutal atrocities. In one instance, he had thousands of civilians, priests, women, and children tied to ships, which were then sunk. Carrier would later be found guilty of war crimes and executed. Back in Paris, the government was still dominated by moderates. With the war going badly, revolts in the provinces, and the economy getting worse, it seemed the government just wasn't doing a very good job. Radicals' fear for the safety of the revolution intensified, and Marat even began calling for the moderates in the government to be executed. In return, the moderates called for the arrest of Marat. This led to a chain of events with the two sides in heated conflict. Robespierre declared the Jacobins to be an insurrection and called on the people to arm themselves. It all ended on the 31st of May 1793, with the National Convention surrounded by radical sans-culottes and 29 moderate Girondin politicians.
Yes, the sans-culottes were the radicalized and militant partisans of the French Revolution, mainly consisting of common of the lower classes, and the Girondists were deputies originally from the Girondin department in France.
Arrested. From this moment on, the moderates ceased to be a political force. Robespierre and his radicals would be in almost total control of the government. And this brings us to the story of a woman named Charlotte Corday. Charlotte lived in the northwest city of Caen, and like many in the area, was horrified at the rapid radicalization and increasing violence of the revolution. And the man she blamed more than anyone was Jean-Paul Marat. She wanted to bring peace back to France, and so she did something...
You know, she's not wrong. Marat was really important in intensifying, pouring gas on the fire, basically, and intensifying the political violence of the revolution.
Drastic. She traveled to Paris and told Marat she had a list of enemies for him to publish in his paper. Marat eagerly invited her in for a meeting. So where's that list of enemies you promised me? Here it is. Wait a minute. This isn't a list of enemies. It just says, yippee-ki-yay, mother... And just like that, Marat was no more. Charlotte was quickly arrested and sent to the guillotine. Her dream of restoring peace, however, died with her. Marat became a martyr. In temples of reason, symbols of the dead Marat became the new crucifix. In death, he became an even more powerful inspiration for the extreme levels of violence that were about to rip throughout.
Yes, and that is the problem with killing these highly influential figures, is that if you do so, you make them a martyr, and the situation likely becomes even worse than it were before. Of course, I don't think Corday had any idea what sort of literal terror this would bring upon France.
At the new republic. That's right, here comes the Reign of Terror. If you thought this revolution already sounds pretty violent, well, you ain't seen nothing yet, son. The radicals were now in control, and they believed not only was France surrounded by foreign enemies, but that within the masses, there were also plenty of internal ones too. Individuals not loyal to the revolution, conspiring to bring about its downfall. Robespierre and the rest of the radical faction were having none of it. A new committee of public safety was established with 12 members. Its purpose was to protect the new French Republic from its enemies, and it basically became a 12-man dictatorship with Robespierre as its leading voice.
Yes, the Committee of Public Safety, another one of these Orwellian names used during the revolution. The Committee of Public Safety was more like the Committee of Public Terror, and it was the provisional government established during the Revolutionary Wars, or at least the first part of it, and it was also served as the war cabinet. And basically, it was a 12-man dictatorship, as they said. It was granted sweeping powers to suppress all internal enemies of the revolution, and they did so.
The Revolutionary Tribunal was also reinstated. A special court created to streamline the process of trying suspected enemies and handing out their death sentences. With these two new institutions, Robespierre wanted to scare France's enemies straight. In September 1793, it was announced that terror would be the order of the day. In other words, fear had become official government policy. And from then onwards, we enter into the period known as the Reign of Terror. Spies and secret police were everywhere and watched the people closely. France's public had to be extremely careful what they said and how they behaved. Obviously, criticizing this new system, or the government, would quickly have you sent off to the guillotine. But that's not all. Even the most minor offense could have you tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Hello, Citizen Martin. Hello, Monsieur Dubois. Monsieur? Did I just hear you say Monsieur? That's the old style of address, my friend. To the guillotine! You know what? I didn't like him, but I do feel kind of bad.
They're exaggerating slightly here, but not by too much, actually. This was a quite ridiculous, almost Stalinist system of state-sponsored terrorism and suppression, and yeah, not good.
For the king and his family. Oof, expressing sympathy for the royal family, are we? To the guillotine! 12 sous for a loaf of bread? That's way overpriced. To the guillotine! Man, this bread line is taking forever. To the guillotine! And you look like you're thinking anti-revolutionary thoughts. To the guillotine. Max, we're sending way too many people to the guillotine. To the guillotine! Chop, 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 chop. It was insane. All across France, about 40,000 people were killed for suspected crimes against liberty. Let's say your neighbor won't stop mowing the lawn at 7 in the morning. Well, then all you gotta do is tell the government they've been talking smack about the revolution. And there's a good chance they'll end up in front of the Revolutionary Tribunal. Maybe they'll even be executed, taking a metaphorical load off your shoulders and a literal one off theirs. The most prominent victim of the Reign of Terror was a certain Marie Antoinette, who was finally tried and found guilty of treason in 1793. She expected she'd be brought to the guillotine in a royal carriage, fit for a queen. All the Republic could provide for her, however, was a wooden tumbrel.
Yes, her husband, Louis XVI, was actually given the dignity of a closed carriage, which took him to the execution site. No such privileges were afforded to Marie Antoinette.
At 37 years old, the most hated woman in French history met her end on the 16th of October, 1793. Robespierre had saved the revolution through terror. Internal dissent was being suppressed. The food situation was no longer quite as bad. Even the French military had got its act together again and pummeled the Allies at the Battle of...
Yes, thanks to the mass levy system, France was doing surprisingly well, all things considered. And they actually, after Fleurus, they managed to take control of the Austrian Netherlands, and yeah, it was quite a remarkable achievement on part of the French armies.
Fleurus. For Danton and his followers, the time was right to try to normalize the French Republic. Hey Robespierre, so we were thinking that since things are finally going better, maybe we should rein in the terror. And while we're on it, we could possibly start taking it easier on the church, and also try to end this costly war. Oh, crap. As time went on, Robespierre seemed to go, for lack of a better term, a bit mental.
Pretty much.
He was hell-bent on creating what he called a republic of virtue, and for him, this meant amping up the bloodshed even more. Throughout the spring and summer of 1794, executions reached an unprecedented level during a period known as the Great Terror. Even those closest to him found their way to the guillotine if they dared oppose his ideas and actions, and he began alienating himself from the rest of the convention. He created a new deistic religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being.
Yeah, the Cult of the Supreme Being replaced the Cult of Reason, and I couldn't really tell you what the idea behind it was. It was really not clear to me, and I don't think it was clear to the people living at the time what the hell the Cult of the Supreme Being was. And yeah, both the Cult of Reason and Cult of the Supreme Being was actually banned when Napoleon took power, because, you know, these are just weird things.
Along with the new annual Festival of the Supreme Being. Man, I think Robespierre is really starting to lose it. He thinks he's a god or something. Nonsense. Sure, he's gone a little extreme, but he doesn't think he's a god. My children, bathe your immortal souls in the virtue of my republic. Okay, yeah, he's completely lost it. Robespierre's ultimate mistake, however, came on July 26th when he made a speech to the National Convention in which he said this: "I have in my hand a brand new list of enemies to be sent to the guillotine, and many of you are on this list, but I'm not going to tell you who yet." What do you think of that? I think we should send Robespierre to the guillotine first.
Yeah, this was a. He really overplayed his hand here, and this is actually a common way to get at your enemies or rivals. If we look at, for example, Roman history, Emperor Aurelian himself was, uh, you know, killed by his own soldiers after one of his administrators basically said to everyone that Aurelian had a secret list of enemies to be executed. And the army feared that they might be on the list, so the army killed Aurelian. Really sad chapter in Roman history, but I digress.
All in favor? Oh no! 2 days later, Robespierre became the final victim of the monstrous terror and paranoia he had created. Many
Ironic, isn't
historical
it?
accounts of the revolution end here with the death of Robespierre
Yeah, the revolution didn't end in 1794, I don't agree with that, but the most radical part of the revolution definitely ended here.
and his terror. But the revolution officially continued for another 5 years until 1799. So what happened between now and then? Well, after the fall of Robespierre, a more moderate political group called the Thermidorians took control of the convention.
Yes, this was known as the Thermidorian reaction, and the reaction basically meant an end to economic and just general populism, the end of the de-Christianization phase of the revolution, and the harsh wartime measures imposed by the Committee of Public Safety. And the reaction also saw the so-called White Terror, in which the Jacobin Club was disbanded, the sans-culottes were dispersed, and the followers of Robespierre and Marat were massacred. But unlike the Reign of Terror, this was not sponsored by the state, it was more spontaneous reaction to the people who had supported the terror.
They wanted to restore stability to the government. Now, Robespierre's allies and other radicals who had fueled the terror themselves became the target of political suppression. Bourgeois street fighters took on the radical sans-culottes in the streets during a period named the White Terror. In 1795, the Thermidorians drafted a new constitution and created a government called the Directory, with the purpose of preventing power from being able to fall into the hands of a single individual again.
Yes, the Directory was, for all intents and purposes, a 5-man committee which basically ruled France as a dictatorship. It was not as authoritarian as the Committee of Public Safety, but it was nonetheless a very inefficient and corrupt system of government, and that allowed Napoleon to rise to power.
As this new government was being established, royalists who wanted to bring the monarchy back to France saw this moment as an opportunity to strike. They staged an insurrection in Paris and battled.
It should also be mentioned that the new constitution, yes, another constitution, established the so-called Council of Ancients and Council of 500 to replace the old legislative assemblies, and the requirements for gaining entries to these assemblies were much higher than before, and as a result, it was more of an elite establishment to ensure that the revolution would remain moderate in nature from here on out.
With the National Guard in the streets. Luckily, one Napoleon Bonaparte happened to be in Paris at the time, and he took control of the situation, firing on the crowd and putting down the insurrection.
Yes, this is known as the events of the 13th Vendémiaire, in which a royalist insurrection tried to take advantage of the fact that the Directories was being established and overthrow the Republican government and reinstate the monarchy. However, unfortunately, Napoleon was in Paris at the time, and he effectively organized the city's defense despite being heavily outnumbered. And he basically saved the revolution.
From this moment on, the people of Paris would never again be able to stage a popular uprising and lost their control over the revolution. For his actions, Napoleon became a general and was sent to take control of the French armies in Italy. The new
We will have a look at the Italian campaigns of Napoleon another time. We'll talk more about him, I can assure you.
Directory remained a fairly ineffective government for the remainder of the revolution. It was plagued with corruption and struggled to keep the economy afloat, and as a result, wasn't very popular. For the people of France, with the strict social customs of both royalist France and the terror gone, they didn't really know what to do with themselves. Men no longer removed their hats when talking to women. Different classes began intermingling, and a publication began circulating that looked a lot like a modern dating app. It was social anarchy. Outside of France, the war continued. In 1795, France took the Netherlands, where they set up a puppet state. Then they negotiated both Prussia and Spain out of...
Yes, the French Republic would create many of these puppet states. They called them sister republics. And basically what they did was take over a place, establish a satellite state, and made them go forward with instituting revolutionary reforms. And of course, they call them sister republics, to make them look independent brothers of the revolution. They were not. They were French client states.
The war. The British attempted to land French royalists in the west to reinforce rebellion, but that plan failed. In 1796, the French planned a three-pronged attack with the aim of marching on Vienna and knocking Austria out of the war. The two northern armies were defeated and forced to retreat. However, Napoleon in the south, with groundbreaking military strategy, won battle after battle after battle. He pushed the Austrians out of Italy and began closing in on Vienna. The Austrians freaked out, and Napoleon oversaw the signing of a peace treaty. He had almost single-handedly knocked Austria out of the war.
I would argue that he single-handedly knocked Austria out of the war. Not almost.
And by the way, he was only 28, so maybe it's about time you moved out of your mom's basement. Napoleon became a famed hero among the French people, but his aspirations were still higher. He briefly went off to Egypt and discovered a bunch of gnarly Egyptian stuff, but then the British destroyed his fleet and trapped his forces. Say, Napoleon, sir, you're not going to leave us here stuck in Egypt and return to France, are you? Nonsense, my boy. I would never dream of abandoning my loyal soldiers. Wow, what's that over there? On his return to Paris, Napoleon found himself to be extremely popular, and the government extremely unpopular, and he started getting some power-hungry ideas. Conveniently, a politician named Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès approached Napoleon and said, "Hey man, since you're so popular, do you want to help me stage a coup?" "Great idea! Let's stage a coup, and then I'll coup you." What? Napoleon, with the help of his politician brother, entered the government chamber, possibly got punched in the face, and finally his troops...
Yes, at this point, after returning from Egypt, Napoleon was immensely popular, and he's mostly responsible for that popularity. He made sure that stories came back to France telling about his great exploits, and people already knew his exploits from the Italian campaigns, of course, but this really skyrocketed his status. And he decided to do a coup against the very unpopular Directory. He had the help of Lucien Bonaparte, who was his younger brother, and he was conveniently the president of the Council of 500, which was the lower house at this time, and he was able to convince the council that a Jacobin coup was imminent, and so he had both legislative assemblies transferred to a palace outside of Paris, and they were surrounded by the military for protection purposes. But in reality, Napoleon was planning a coup. Of course, things didn't go as well as he had hoped. When he entered the Council of 500, tried to convince them to introduce a new constitution, he was met with a very hostile reception, and it was only thanks to Lucien and Murat, his future marshal, that he was able to carry out this coup in the end.
Intimidated the council to dissolve the government and create a new constitution that basically made Napoleon a dictator. So there you have it, the French Revolution, born with the great promise of liberty and equality. The common people dared challenge an oppressive system that had existed for centuries. But before they knew it, they found liberty sidelined by terror, equality that possibly didn't quite hit the mark, and an absolute monarchy replaced by an absolute dictator. Napoleon began stabilizing French society. He restored the Catholic Church and got rid of that crazy calendar, among other things. But he remained ever ambitious. He was France's first consul. but he slept soundly at night dreaming of being something even bigger. Napoleon's expansionist aspirations, combined with the ongoing conflict in Europe, would eventually lead the continent into a huge conflict known today as...
Yes, and if you've been following the channel, you know that I am currently doing Epic History TV's Napoleonic Wars series, so check that out if you're interested in that. Yes, we reached the end of the video. Alright, that was OverSimplified's mini-series on the French Revolution. The French Revolution is perhaps the most important event in modern European history, and I cannot even begin to list all of the consequences of it. But yeah, this is a story that deserves to be told and people need to know about, because much of things in modern society wouldn't exist without the revolution. But in any case, if you liked the video, leave a like, please leave a comment if you have anything to add, and subscribe for more content. I'll see you guys next time.